Good evening. Thank you for joining us for tonight's panel on Polling and Democracy, The Road Ahead, hosted by the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research. Our expert panelists will discuss a range of topics, including the importance of polls for democratic representation, evolving survey methodologies, and the future of polling. My name is Peter Enns. I'm a professor in the government department at Cornell University, co-director of the Cornell Center for Social Sciences, and executive director of the Roper Center. I'm also co-founder of Reality Check Insights. As many of you know, the Roper Center, which is housed at Cornell, is the world's largest public opinion data archive. Founded in 1947 to preserve and share Elmo Roper's survey data, the center now includes a searchable database of almost 25,000 public opinion polls from more than 100 different countries. The database also allows users to search nearly 800,000 survey questions and responses. These survey questions and data offer a permanent record of the public's voice from around the world from 1935 to today. Last year, the Roper website had more than 1.3 million page views and over 500,000 data searches. Tonight, the conversation will touch on this historical record and will also look to the future of polling. After I introduce our panel, the panelists will each take 2 minutes to provide opening remarks to frame the conversation. We will then transition to Q&A. We invite you in the audience to enter questions for the panel in the chat. We have just over an hour for our conversation, which will end at 7:15 p.m. First, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Agesta. Jennifer is the Director of Polling and Election Analytics at CNN. She works out of CNN's Washington Bureau and produces all of the network's polling and leads its election night decision team. She previously served as Director of Polling at the Associated Press, leading the polling unit, which conducted domestic and international survey research. I should note that CNN has archived more than 51,000 survey questions and 1,875 data sets with the Roper Center. Next, Scott Keeter is a senior survey advisor at Pew Research Center, where he provides methodological guidance to all of Pew Research Center's research areas. He's a past president of the American Association for Public Opinion Research, and in 2016, he won their highest honor, the APOR Award for Lifetime Achievement, for outstanding contributions to the field of public opinion research. Pew has archived almost 61,000 survey questions and nearly 800 data sets with the Roper Center. Sunshine Hilligus is professor of political science at Duke University. She is also director of the Duke Initiative on Survey Methodology and co-director of the Polarization Lab. She has co-authored 3 books and published widely on the topics of American political behavior, campaigns and elections, survey methods, public opinion, and information technology and politics. David Wilson is Senior Associate Dean and Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. David's research examines how individuals formulate their political preferences about race and justice and how social cognition shapes broader survey response behaviors. He is co-author of the forthcoming book, Racial Resentment in the Political Mind. Our 5th panelist is Doug Rivers, who is a professor of political science at Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Doug has founded 2 successful technology companies, Preview Systems and Knowledge Networks, and he is chief scientist at YouGov. He is a past recipient of the American Association for Public Opinion Research Innovators Award and a member of the Roper Center's Board of Directors. We are absolutely thrilled to have the 5 of you with us this evening. So, Jennifer, can you start us off with a few opening remarks?
Sure, happy to. Thank you so much for having me for this panel. Polling has been a really critical part of CNN's coverage of elections and politics for a very long time. And it is hard to imagine a world where it would be anything other than a central facet of any serious news organization's efforts to cover American politics. There simply is no better way to report on what people want from their government and how they feel about life in America today. But polling has become so entwined with elections in the eyes of so many that it is difficult for some to remember what it is that polling is supposed to do. I'm often asked why we even bother to do national polls when the Electoral College or the battleground House districts are the only thing that really matters. My standard reply is that the government represents all the people, whether they vote or not, whether they live in a toss-up state or they live here in DC, where the Democrats typically win by 90 points. And my job is to report on the opinions of everyone in this country. And all of that has made the last couple of months in polling really, really hard for a lot of us. I'm sure we're going to have time later to dissect the 2020 polls and the election results in greater detail. And it is important to note that we do not yet know all of the reasons why those things differed. But it's very clear that polling across methodologies understated support for Donald Trump. And although the polling in 2018 was pretty good at the national level, there were some meaningful misses understating Republicans at the state level as well, in Missouri and Indiana, and even in Florida. After 2016, we had what looked like really clear explanations for what went wrong in the polling in some places. And at CNN, we reworked a lot of our polling standards to emphasize the polls and the pollsters who took the steps that the industry outlined as necessary to correct for those errors. But unfortunately, I don't think it was enough. I'm hopeful that the 2020 results can help the industry to figure out solutions that will work to restore public faith in survey research, because the work we do outside of elections is so critical to journalism and to keeping an open line between those elected to govern and the people.
Thank you for that perspective, Jen. Scott, how about your initial thoughts?
Well, thank you, Peter. Really great to be part of this panel with these distinguished participants. It just may be my generally positive disposition about things, but I'm pretty bullish about the future of the field. Despite the obvious problems that we face and the performance of the election polls in 2016 and 2020, I'd point to a few things. The rise of panels. There have been non-probability panels, opt-in panels around for a while, but now we're seeing a lot of new probability-based panels, both here in the U.S. and elsewhere. This is a very positive thing, I think, from a variety of perspectives. Panels give us a lot of levers that we can use to better model estimates. They also make it easier to bring in data from other sources, different levels than the individual level that the surveys are done on. And that has some great potential as well for us. Outside of that technique issue is that I think that the level of talent working in the field now is really quite good. And it's potentially getting better because I think the sophistication of graduate training in cognate fields to survey research has really ramped up. But I'm not Pollyanna. I don't deny that we have enormous challenges. In particular, I don't think that from the election polling perspective, we figured out how to poll elections that have populist candidates as well as we can in other elections that don't have populist candidates. And maybe we're going to have a lot of populist candidates going forward. So we have to figure that out. We need to be able to get valid parameters for a lot of variables that are beyond the things that we can get from government surveys and administrative records. Because I think that the secret to modeling, the secret to accuracy as non-response grows and grows and grows is going to be better modeling. And we just are going to need more tools for that. As Jennifer noted, our polling in smaller geographies still leaves a lot to be desired. And there are a bunch of other issues with panels that we haven't cracked. But on the whole, I think the field is up to the challenges that we face and look forward to talking about some of those.
Thank you, Scott. Sunshine.
Thanks for having me, Peter. So I want to reiterate the point that I think it's unfortunate that we as a field are judged by pre-election polls, and there's all kinds of reasons that I think that's a problem, and that I think it has an impact on our ability to do a good job in those surveys that are just evaluating public opinion, or even just the Census Bureau doing their job. And so we do have to worry about pre-election polling. And ultimately, I think we ask too much of the pre-election polls, and that the key thing to think about in terms of the future is how we can not only do a better job of benchmarking, so looking beyond demographics that are available in government surveys to change weighting, but also how can we better represent the uncertainty that comes with our predictions? I think there's a lot of false precision in polling numbers, particularly pre-election polling numbers, and we need as a field to invest in ways to better figure out how to propagate the uncertainty that comes from the more complete data generating process, both the sampling error, but also all of the decisions that go into, and the data generating process that goes into the estimates that come out at the end and get reported by the journalists.
Thanks, Sunshine. David.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here among this esteemed group. I know all of them well, and they've helped me in some way in my career, and I really think this is a good contribution to public opinion research and the conversation more generally. I was drawn into survey research methods and public opinion by two main things. The first was data is cool, so any chance you get to play in data, it's a good thing. And the second thing was the pride from democratic practice, this idea that we can give voice to people who aren't in charge. And so when polls are done well, they offer us a unique telescope into society. But the telescope is only as good as the direction where we point it. And I tend to point my telescope on issues of race and justice. And so in her inaugural poem, Amanda Gorman said, "We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it." And I was curious, what do our telescopes tell us about this force? What does it look like? How massive is it? But also, where is it more likely to reside and why? And so we always spend a lot of times talking about elections and election predictions and margins and how well we predict the outcome versus the actual predicted margin of the outcome. But we also need to have an equitable conversation about race and ask ourselves why we didn't see an insurrection coming. Did we miss something like racial justice and how it can motivate both the public good, like civic engagement, as much as it can motivate public danger, like civic threat? And I would argue, yes, because we tend to ignore the correlates of insurrection, things like race. We tend to study race when it's convenient, when somebody else is paying for it, only when we have extra space on a survey, or as periodic as is called for during an insurrection or some other period of domestic intranquility. So to some in the public, it wasn't about the insurrection, it was about the reactions to it. And speaking specifically to African Americans who may have seen the insurrection not as so surprising, but how there's not been much real law enforcement behind it as much as you would see in other kinds of events. So my bottom line is really that we need to offer the public more estimates and information than election margins. And we need to diversify where we point our telescopes and also diversify who participates in telling us where we should point them. So I appreciate being involved, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, David.
Yep.
Doug.
Thanks, Peter. Good to be here. On the Thursday after the election, I did an interview with David Leonhardt, who was writing a piece for the Times on what went wrong with polling, which was the first of many painful discussions on that topic for me in the last 3 months. And I just flown back from New York after we'd figured out that Biden really had won, and a little groggy, and we spoke for a long time. It had to be at least a couple hours. And after all that, the only thing he quoted me saying was, "We," meaning the polling industry, "are going to get a black eye over this." It was, I think, a really disappointing result since the industry at large had done a lot of work since 2016 trying to deal with what was perceived as a pretty bad miss in 2016. And we ended up with a worse miss in 2020, even though we got the outcome right. election polling is hard. There aren't a lot of things in public opinion research that really depend on getting the answer right to plus or minus a couple points. But being off by 2%, which is about the percent the average poll was off of the Trump vote in 2020, is considered a big miss. So we're asking a lot to be able to predict elections accurately. And I think we can do better than we did in either 2016 or 2020. But without being overly defensive, I think there's a lot of stuff that we did get right this year. So first, Donald Trump did not win this election by a landslide. The states that turned out to be close, like Arizona and Georgia and Pennsylvania, did turn out to be close. Though it shouldn't have shocked anyone that Joe Biden won those states. We did know that Trump would do better in 2020 with minorities than he did in 2016, though I think we underestimated how well he would do. We knew turnout was going to be really high, especially voting by mail. The election day and early in-person vote, we knew would skew Republican. And it would be reported first in most places. So a lot of the post-election narrative about a stolen election and so forth were things that we knew weren't true from the pre-election polling. And these, I think, are important things to know, and a lot of Americans still don't know them. So I have no intention of giving up on election polling.
Thanks, Doug. And thanks for all of those intro comments, and which to kind of touched on polling and elections, but also another type, David and Jen to some extent, sort of what are we asking in polls? So I want to start with a question that's more on the sort of second side of this, and which sort of goes back to something from Sidney Verba. In his presidential address to the American Political Science Association in 1995, Verba said, "Surveys produce just what democracy is supposed to produce, equal representation of all citizens. Surveys are not perfectly representative, but offer nevertheless a better cross-section of the public than do almost any other means, and certainly they are more representative than any of the modes of citizen activity." So David, if it's all right, let's start with you. And I'm curious, and maybe you can build on your introductory remarks. Do surveys produce just what democracy is supposed to produce?
Of course, it's a good question, and it's one that has boggled the mind for centuries now. It reminds me of a quote that everyone is equal, it's just that some are more equal than others. So yes, the theory is that every person in the population has an equal chance of being selected. And therefore, if you do that well, you'll have a representative voice. But there is an element of democratic justice to public opinion polling, and you can think about it as it relates to studying African Americans. So in theory, we only need 120 African American respondents for every 1,000 total respondents to be representative. But when you think about the impact of African Americans on the consequences of the election and politics more generally, they are a group that had a huge impact on the election outcome. And it raises questions about what we need to understand about their political behavior that we may not have picked up on before, or we may not be studying on a regular basis. If we took African Americans out of the electorate, the election outcome would have likely been different. And so we need to do more to have representative voices and not just have proportional representative voices.
That's great. I'm curious, Jennifer, what would you add from the media's perspective? And this might be in terms of representation and this idea of poll surveys being what democracy is supposed to produce, but also just the general conveying of public opinion in a democracy and what media's responsibility is.
Yeah, I mean, the representation question is obviously a big one for media organizations. As I said sort of at the top, we are really trying to convey the real opinions of Americans as they are, not as a reporter happens to encounter in whatever place they happen to land in whatever swing state they've gone to. You really need scientific research to get the full picture of what public opinion is. But as David notes, there are some subsets of the population, particularly by race and ethnicity, but also in terms of partisanship and ideology and religious beliefs and things like that are critical to the outcome of elections and to the understanding of American politics that are hard to represent with national surveys. And it is one of the things that we think about a lot. And we, will, when we have the resources, do oversamples of certain populations or deeper dives on particular topics. But the resources question, particularly for media pollsters who are sort of a shrinking universe in recent years, is a hard one. And it's one that I think the industry does need to think through. What we're spending our money on within public opinion research reflects our priorities. And right now, we spend a lot of that money to do election research and not as much to do the issues research. And maybe that is a dynamic that we need to rethink in the next round of polling we do.
Great. There's a lot of questions coming in through the chat. So I'll ask this question, and whoever on our panel wants to jump in would be terrific. So this is from Darby Steger. Apologies if I mispronounce the name. And the question is, what are your suggestions for how we can increase public trust in survey research, especially among populations that tend to be high propensity non-respondents? So thoughts from the panel on increasing public trust in survey research.
I'll jump in. I think it will help to have leaders that aren't undermining the media and pollsters. I also think that going back to the point that an important part of polling is not just election polling, and the fact that I know there's an incredible incentive for media organizations to focus on pre-election polling and to strive for that gold star and get an accurate prediction. But in terms of what I think is critically important for democracy and for trust in the polling is the reporting of the issues, reporting of what the public believes between election cycles. And I think seeing that more in between elections is an important part of having an impact and gaining trust.
That's great. Anybody else want to chime in on increasing public trust in polling and surveys?
Of course, the resident political scientists, which are several of us on the panel, would talk about a better job of public engagement and teaching young people about civics, and hopefully them teaching their parents a little bit about civics as well. This may not just be about trust in polling so much as it's trust in democracy, in a federal government, and a national conversation about tough issues sometimes, and not wanting to simply believe what you already believe, but believe facts as they're presented through public opinion polls. So I think civic education and civics more generally is probably something that needs to be instituted for us to get on real track with trust in public opinion polling.
Peter, I think one other point to add on trust in public opinion polls and with people who may not know that much about what we do is that we should be as transparent as we possibly can about how we're doing polls and why we're making the choices that we make. Part of our reworking of our standards after 2016 was to demand more transparency from the pollsters that we cover. And we don't report every detail of that, but I need to know the answers to those questions before I will pass your information along to CNN's readers and viewers. And I think that the more that we can tell people about what we're doing, about what we know, about who's talking to us and who's not talking to us, and what we know about the validity of our data, when we're saying that this is what the election looks like right now, this is what likely voters are, what does that mean? Can you explain that in real terms to the people who are reading your stories and following your news? And I think that would help to improve the public's understanding of polls, which I would hope would increase their trust in them.
Terrific. Yeah, disclosure and transparency is critically important, and something at the Roper Center we're very strong advocates of and working toward with the folks who provide us data, who provide so much information about their methods. Any other thoughts on this point of public trust?
Well, the level of participation in polls has been falling for a generation and is at crisis levels for most levels of media polling that attempt to do random selection, with response rates in the low single digits. We've gotten to a place where it makes polling extremely difficult. I think I'd also agree with what Sunshine said about the polarization that's occurred, where things that weren't previously politicized, like press reporting and participating in polls, have become politicized, like things like wearing masks or voting by mail. Who would have thought that these things would become polarizing issues in politics? I'd hope that these things would go back to being, most pollsters are out there to give an accurate representation of what the public thinks in between elections when you get to register your vote, and that we do it as best we know how. That when I look at a poll, what I want to be is right more than the candidate that I prefer wins.
Building on that topic of sort of the polarization and the topics of polling, Rich Clark has a question. Given that so much of the policies that affect Americans' lives happens at the state and local level, should we advocate for fewer national polls in favor of more state and local polling? And I think again, even if many of you have talked about not just election polling, but polling on the issues of people's lives. So on any subject matter, what are your thoughts on whether the polls themselves should be focusing at state and local level, or whether national polls should continue to be the focus? And Jen, I know you touched on the importance of representing the nation, but I'm curious if there's anybody advocating more state or local polling.
Well, I certainly think that there should be. I got my start in the polling side of this work being a state pollster, and I saw the value of it in Virginia where I was working. There's a dearth of it. If you could build a decent state poll, you had opportunities to get the ear of policymakers because they didn't get a lot of state polling data. But, it's also the case that a poll is a poll is a poll. They're all expensive. And, we know that samples have to be just as big at the state level as they do at the national level in order to provide the same level of precision. And we're in a resource crunch all through the media world, in academia, and in polling. And so as much as we'd like to say, gosh, there needs to be lots more state and local polls, it's hard to see where the money comes from for that. So, you know, I think we should do all we can to promote it. And certainly for elections, you know, we know that the errors in the state polls were higher. And that would bring me back to the national polling. I mean, national polling can serve the interest of state polling by providing good models and providing other kind of context information. And so it's not an either or, we need both.
I would like to add just, you know, a couple thoughts to build on that. And one is, you know, you think about the fact that it's media organizations who are predominantly doing the polling and just the absolute, you know, decimation of state level, newspapers, right? That there is a tie between the fact that the media organizations at the state level are willing to report on any kind of entrepreneurial pollster who's willing to do a survey in the state because they don't have the resources to pay for their own. And a lot of the tension that we have seen in election polls is the fact that there's a desire for this information. And so we have had people come in and fill and give that information for free for the sake of getting their names in the papers. And so there is this variation in quality when you look at national level polling that is, you know, funded by the major media organizations versus the state level polling. Now, at the end of the day, I mean, I think that the point about transparency is key. The point about we have to be able to, you know, not necessarily, like, we can't just classify everything as being, you know, gold standard or absolute junk, right? That we have to be able to figure out how to extract useful information from polling of all quality types. And some of that is, I think, on survey methodologists to make some advances to help out the journalists and figure out what it is that we are able to say and frankly and admit when we can't say something because of uncertainty.
Thanks. And Scott mentioned that it seemed like more errors or slightly less accuracy in state polls. And Sunshine, you offered some possible explanations in terms of just the variance of methods and approaches, which are a function of just budget constraints. It seemed to me in reading about the polls through the election that even across all methods, states were harder. And I wonder, it seems like from a scientific sampling perspective, that it shouldn't be harder in the states. But is polling harder in the states? Meaning, if we took the same method at the national and state level, is it harder to represent the views of the public, or is that not the case? Anybody have thoughts on that?
Well, it's much easier for a national poll because so much of the variation in national polls is across regions and demographic groups for which the targets are well known at the national level, and they have a lot of variance between them. I don't think it's actually that national polling methodology is any better than state polling. There were plenty of national polls that had huge errors. In 2020, there were some of the national pollsters using the so-called high-quality live interviewer phone techniques that had huge errors. The state polls tend to be smaller budget, smaller sample, and more homogeneous populations, which are harder to essentially weight your way to an accurate result.
That's super helpful. Errors in election polling have come up a few times, and that's often, you know, as it's been mentioned, how polls are scrutinized. But I want to point to a 2018 article by Will Jennings and Chris Vlejian, and they took a very broad approach, analyzing 30,000 national polls from 351 general elections in 45 countries between 1942 and 2017. And my read of that article is that historically the polls have done quite well. And if anything, on average, they've done even better in recent years. So I'm curious, and Scott, maybe we'll start with you. How would you, characterize the history of polling? Is my read of that article and the data accurate?
Yes, I think Will and Chris did us a huge service with that piece. I mean, they pulled together an enormous amount of data. They analyzed it with a great deal of rigor, and they showed that election polling is not getting less accurate over time. If anything, it may be getting more accurate. I think that's especially the case if you look at the U.S. case and compare the early decades when polling was much less accurate than it is now with more recent elections. Now, 2016 and 2020 are big in people's minds. And I think that reflects the evolution of our field, even as we were running into greater amounts of non-response and potential bias there, that we've figured out how to do some of this better than we did in the past. But if we're going to talk about the history, I think there are a couple of other things to think about. One of them is that we really don't want the history of polling to be defined solely by the accuracy of election polling. I mean, that is, I think, unfortunately, something that we brought on ourselves to some degree, because we kind of dine out on the idea that, hey, our election polls are accurate, so you can trust all this other stuff that we're doing on issues. And so then when your election polls are not accurate, then you get people saying, well, all polling is bunk and should be thrown away. And, we got that thrown in our face in 2020 from a lot of people, including people who ought to know better. I think there's one other point I'd make about history, and that goes back to something that David brought up, and that is, we don't have a good history in this country of polling minorities or polling about racial minorities. Early polling tended to be incredibly discriminatory, excluded blacks from samples in the South, either because they were themselves excluded from the electorate and thus not deemed relevant to what was going on, or for just straight out racist reasons, such as concern that subscribers to the polls might react negatively to the inclusion of minorities. I mean, we've come a long way since those days, but, the fact is racial and ethnic minorities remain underrepresented in our profession. And one last thing is we still see national polls released that don't interview in Spanish.
A lot there. Thanks, Scott. And anybody else want to chime in on the sort of broader historical context of polling and what the implications are for us today? And it's okay if not, because we've got a ton of questions here. So I'm going to go on to another question. And if anybody wants to bring in that historical context, by all means, please do. But Liz Suhe asks a question. So thanks, Liz. And she writes, and this is for anybody, of course, response rates to random digit dial polls are so low. And she references Doug's comment about single digits. She says, I don't see how we can model our way out of it. Too many people are missing. Should we give up on RDD polls? What's the alternative?
Well, as a frequent practitioner of RDD polls, I'd be happy to take a stab at that one. I don't know that I am in a place where I'm ready to completely walk away from that methodology. It is hard. It is difficult. It takes more effort, more time, more money to do it right and to do it well right now. But I think that it is worth it because of what we know about the types of people who are not reached when you rely entirely on panels or entirely on lists. We know that there are certain people who are never going to join a panel, who are never going to show up on a voter list, and it's entirely possible that they will also never answer their phone, but at least I've tried, you know? So I feel like it's important for our understanding of public opinion that RDD polls continue to exist, that they continue to be out there alongside these other methodologies. And I think that all of them together can serve as a check on each other, and to help us to understand what people are really thinking, who we might be missing, who we might not be. That methodological diversity, I think, is just critical for the field going forward.
I guess the thing that I would say is that what I would really like to see some methodological development is in the integration of big data and surveys in a way that allows for us to extract information, but also extract information with the appropriate caveats. And so, this gets back to the point a bit about transparency. And I think that it's important for academia to be especially involved in this, because we need to convince the National Science Foundation, we need to convince the Census Bureau, we need to convince those who will fund us that this is critical. Again, not to say that only one method is the right way, but to figure out what is the right way to talk about the information that we do have. And there's no doubt that there's different sources of error in panels versus in probability type sampling, and we have to be able to sort this out in a more transparent but also more rigorous way that I think that we have done now, where it everything is kind of divided into the all or nothing, and I think that's not a terribly helpful way forward for the field.
I think there's plenty of room for methodological diversity. So at one end, we have, the census surveys, which do still maintain fairly high response rates, so the CPS took a big hit during the pandemic. The other end of the spectrum, we have opt-in panels that are an order of magnitude less expensive to collect data on, but depend entirely on modeling for validity. The problem with RDD is it's kind of an uncomfortable place in the middle. It's pretty expensive, and it's cooperation has fallen to the point where it doesn't have any kind of statistical guarantees associated with it. But I think everyone is struggling to find what's the right technology to replace older methods of in-person and telephone interviewing, and we're still in a world where we haven't found a rock-solid solution.
Sue asks, David, were you going to jump in? Because please do.
No, I was just going to offer that the importance of the mode of data collection kind of question gets to the estimation, usually the descriptive estimation of something, but I'm very much interested in the correlates of things, right? So the correlation between approval rating and vote may be more interesting than just knowing the vote. And so the other kinds of error that we don't often think about are measurement error, item non-response error, attention span when you use different kinds of methodologies. And one of the things I've tended to do in my work is survey experiments, where we randomize different versions of a question and we try and test our ideas out through these survey experiments rather than simple estimation of a univariate or single variable in a study. So I think that the discipline is innovating, and we're kind of in the middle of the mixture, and something will rise to the top that has a lot of unique qualities that'll give us some new tools down the road. So I'm optimistic about our ability to use surveys to understand society, even if we increase 0.08 on our error scale sometimes.
That's great. We've got a question from Sue, kind of about methods, and really important point here. You know, when we're talking about random digit dial phone calls, she asks, are you referring in general to landline phones or cell phone polls? And so I wonder, we've talked about the traditional random digit dial phone surveys. We've talked about panels. If any of our panelists want to sort of maybe give a super brief overview of when phone polls are done, how sort of what efforts or strategies are being used to try to get the responses as high as possible? And then if anybody wants to also give kind of what is the super high level, when we say a panel, what's the intuition? Sort of, Doug mentioned that it's less expensive and mentioned modeling, but what's sort of the baseline intuition? So does somebody want to, maybe one person take the phone side and the other person, somebody else take the panel side, with the recognition or caveat that multi-method strategy approaches, it seems to be, I'm hearing, maybe the way of the future, but I think just kind of drilling down on those two angles might be really informative.
I can talk about the phone side, if I can be our phone representative here. So our surveys of Americans over the phone, we dial in our most recent iteration, 75% of our interviews are conducted over cell phones, 25% on landlines. And then there is weighting applied to balance those numbers to the most recent NHIS statistics on phone use within those groups, so that you have the right mix of people by the types of phones that they have in their homes. And, you know, some of the changes that we've looked at making since the election, honestly, are, you know, extending our field period to give our phone rooms more time to be able to make more phone calls at different times to try to reach people who are just not reachable in some way, or using, supplementing our straight up RDD sample with sample that has some demographic information appended, so that you can make more of an effort to reach out to people who we know to be in hard to reach populations. That's sort of along the lines of what the New York Times and CNN were doing with their voter file work in the last cycle. And you can take steps like that to try to bring more balance to the sample that you are dialing. And then on the back end, of course, everything is weighted to the demographic targets that we get from census and other high quality, benchmark parameters. And that's the basic practice that you can do. So.
One really quick before we go into panels, we've got a question from Aaron asking about the cost of an RDD survey for 1,000 respondents. And I don't know, Jen, if you or anybody else has kind of a ballpark answer to that, just when we're thinking of a survey, and maybe it's not okay to share on a panel like this, but sort of what the price range is.
I don't know that I can talk about exactly what we're, it's not really like a thing, but I mean, it's many thousands of dollars. They are very expensive to do. That is fair to say.
Not being in that business, I can give you my impression that the numbers run from about $30,000 to over $100,000, depending on what kind of field work you're buying.
Great.
I can talk a little bit about the panels. Indeed, we were an RDD shop for most of our history. The predecessor to the Pew Research Center, the Times Mirror Center for the People in the Press, actually did face-to-face interviewing, but we were RDD for most of the time. But we actually decided to build a panel about 5 years ago because we thought that the costs of doing RDD at the levels that we felt we needed in terms of sample sizes and so forth was just going to become unaffordable. And so we embarked on building a survey panel in 2014. It now has about 13,000 people in it. We recruit now through address-based sampling. That is, we send out a an invitation to a large random sample of people drawn from the delivery sequence file of the Postal Service. And then if people are willing to join, we invite them in and impanel them. If people don't have internet access, then we provide them with a tablet and a data plan to be able to participate, though that is not a fully satisfactory solution to covering the non-internet population by any means. And what we find are the advantages are that we end up accumulating a tremendous amount of information about people that allows us to not have to ask demographic questions every time, so the questionnaires can be shorter, or at least they can be more efficient. That contextual information that we have about people is helpful for analytical purposes. We get extremely high rates of cooperation from the people who are in our panel. 90% typically will take it. And we're trying to improve the rates of participation from the recruitment stage, so that we ultimately have a response rate that's at least as good as RDD, if not better. And we've gotten to that point. So happy to talk more about it, but that's a sort of overview that I think the questioner was asking for.
Yeah, that's great. And Jen mentioned weights with RDD surveys. With the panel, there's going to be attention to weights. And so Jamie Druckman's got a question that I think is really important in this light. So thanks, Jamie. And he asks, is there concern about how the census has played out this cycle, that weights are going to be problematic? And if so, what are the solutions?
Yeah, having just jumped off of the call with the Census Bureau before getting into this session, I think that, number one, consider the fact that a lot of polling firms are not actually necessarily using the decennial for their weighting. They're using the ACS, the American Community Survey, or the current population survey. That said, both of those have been hit by the same type of trends that we have seen in the survey industry, and the difficulty of getting good surveys during the pandemic. And so, I think a broader question, Jamie, is should we be weighting the way that we've been weighting, right? Like we know that weighting on the basis of, demographics alone is not adequate, right? We know that it's not adequate, and yet we continue to go down this road. And my hope would be that actually that there's a convergence of things going on, both in terms of the challenges facing our benchmarks this time around, and the difficulties of the pre-election polls really reinforces the need to reconsider some of our fundamental way of thinking about producing a representative sample. And just to put a pitch, since I'm thrilled to hear so many familiar names in the audience, is that I wish that every single major survey firm or major survey project out there would differentiate between their design weights, right? Like where they have a complex survey design, if that's the case, versus any kind of post-stratification weight that they're doing. Because frankly, like there are other ways that I would like to deal with some of the unit and item non-response than how it's currently being handled. Again, I think these are challenges that we as academics should be looking at. And yeah, I know that there's in the industry presumably a monetary incentive to get the right answer, particularly for a pre-election poll. But I think this is figuring out the weighting is one of the key things that we should view as a lesson or a takeaway from 2020.
Other thoughts on weighting strategies, some of the recommendations Sunshine gave from many of the panelists?
Well, I agree with the point that demographics are not enough. I think one of the thoughts people in the polling world have thought about is various kinds of attitudinal weighting. The problem with that is I don't know where you come up with the targets that are reliable, and particularly ones that are reliable on a subnational basis. One of the advantages of a panel is you can measure things at different points in time. So we do know what the distribution of votes is in local areas down to the precinct level. So we're able to contemporaneously ask vote. So we asked people in November of 2016 how they voted in that election, and we have the same people in 2020. So we don't have to rely entirely on recall. We can calibrate recall measures to what the biases are. Having said that, it worked out pretty well for us in previous years. In 2020, one of the things we noticed is too late, unfortunately, was that the 2016 Trump voters who still approved of Trump in December of 2019 had declining participation rates over 2020. And 2016 Trump voters who were disapproved of him at the end of 2019 actually had increasing participation rates. The only group that actually went up in its participation rate over time. So our weighting on 2016 Trump vote unfortunately had the effect that we had too many 2016 Trump voters who were not enthusiastic about him and too few who were enthusiastic about him.
So that, Doug, that seems to help, because there was a question about the underestimating of Trump in the polls. So that seems to speak to that. Is that right? That sort of declining response rate that you saw?
Yeah, when people ask me what went wrong in the 2020 polls, is we had too few Trump voters. The question is why we had too few of them. And there are a lot of theories out there. That's one that we've seen a little bit of evidence in our data. But realize these effects are small. They're on the order of a couple points.
Yeah, and I would also add, I think it's absolutely the case that we had too few Trump voters. The question is that because we didn't have them in the sample? And I think Doug has some evidence that he didn't have them in the sample, and I think whatever drove that would drive it for other polls as well. But there's also the fact that this was a very weird election. It had a phenomenal turnout in the face of a global and national pandemic. And so I think our ability to determine who was going to vote, our meeting as a field, was seriously challenged by this election. And so when you add in the fact that the country's already very polarized, it's evenly divided, and that the polarization ensures that there is very little split ticket voting, then if you're off by a couple of points in who you think is actually going to show up to vote, it has major consequences for the accuracy. And until we get the voter files in and are able to merge them with our survey data and see if there was a differential turnout on the part of Trump supporters relative to Biden supporters, I think we don't really know why things didn't go the way we expected them to.
Yeah, I mentioned a long-running problem in election surveys is over-reporting of turnout. That the turnout rates that we have in our samples, regardless of what we do about it, are too high. Why is that?
I guess I would just help to outline what are some of those hypotheses about what's going on, and where we, maybe have a little bit of suggestive evidence so far. So, as Scott kind of alluded to, it seems less the case that people are lying about their support of Trump, right? Like when you compare, when there's an interviewer present versus not an interviewer present, you're not finding a big difference in Trump support. So that had been a hypothesis out there that doesn't seem to necessarily be where the answer is. I think the question is are pollsters not reaching Trump people in the first place, right? Because they're less likely to answer their phones, or they're less likely to be in the panels, or that it's about they're hard to reach, or is it that they're more likely to refuse? And I suspect the answer is probably a little bit of both. And if it's more likely to refuse, which I think Doug's done a little bit of work on that in previous election cycle, right? That refusal could matter. Then that's in some ways a bigger problem, I think, than if it's just we're not calling the right exchanges, or we're not reaching people the right way. And Scott, I think it was Courtney Kennedy who mentioned about the paper surveys that you guys did at Pew this time around that were super helpful. And is that that's just a fascinating piece of information in terms of thinking about, if the answer is hard to reach, do we need to rethink about how we're trying to reach people?
I'd like to go back, sort of thinking about these issues in the context of the election. We've talked a little bit about trying to reach other populations, so whether it be minority groups, or we might think of different regions or age group, but also sort of the broader importance of polls for democracy. So knowing what policies the public supports, or what issues the public wants to prioritize. So some of these specific issues that pose a challenge for election polling, are they less of a concern for the broader goal if the poll is to identify the preferences or views of certain groups, or to just understand perspectives, or is it more of a concern, right? So if we think of polling as this general goal of sharing what the public or segments of the public prefer or want or are focused on, are the challenges greater or less of a challenge?
Your big challenge on opinion measurement is that the way you ask the question has an effect on the response several times larger than the sampling error. So sampling error isn't usually that big a deal on most types of opinion measurement, that virtually anything that we do is good enough on sampling error. The hard part, and this makes it hard to report opinion items in the media, is that you may need to ask multiple questions, different ways, and to pin down what the range of responses is. But I think overall we're doing quite a good job of measuring opinion on the key issues that the country faces.
I feel like that's something I want to quote you on, Doug, that the measurement error with the questions is greater, see if I got this right, greater than the sampling error, which sounds legit to me, but I'm curious if the other panelists affirm that or want to question that?
I think it would be great to actually quantify that. I think the thing that is implicit in what we've been talking about, but just to make explicit, is that when you're dealing election polling, you have to come up with your likely voter model. And that is like so difficult and fraught. And frankly, like when it comes time to try and figure out where things get wrong, we oftentimes don't have sufficient information to even figure out how much was the problem of the sample, how much was the problem of the, who's responding, and then how much is just about the likely voter model, because that oftentimes isn't provided along with survey data. And so it means that for the pollsters who are willing to really scrutinize that, like Pew, right, that's a really important contribution, because, when it's all said and done, we can talk about how off the polls were, but we don't necessarily have every bit of information that went into how they ended up with their particular prediction. And as Scott mentioned, right, like that likely voter, the likely voter assumptions are such an important part of that, and really hard to get right.
I think often the inference is the larger error of the rest of them, and that sometimes we draw conclusions from whatever data we have that the measurement might have been okay and the sampling might have been fine, but what we've decided is the cause or the reason why the level of opinion looks the way it does is just based on that we haven't really thought through the theory of why it should. So, for example, when you look at something that has nothing to do with an election around racial justice, for example, we should not only be asking a question about racial justice, but be asking the people who are victims of racial injustice and the people who may be perpetrating it why that is. We should understand the public, not, of course, just the policies, but understand the public and how it thinks about things. Now, when it comes to polling, we don't have all the space in the world to ask all the behavioral questions that we want, but we can innovate. We can think about different ways to activate how people would normally think about an issue with priming and different framing effects that we could induce, and then seeing if the responses change under those conditions. And that helps us to tell a different kind of story than do you support Obamacare versus the Affordable Care Act, right? We know that opinions vary by a lot of different bits and pieces and cues of information that people have. And so we should do more testing of that so that we can honestly say that we're doing a pretty good job of measuring things out there.
That's great. And the breadth of the focus there is super important. Quick question here from Steve Rogers. Steve's asking, and I think this kind of goes back to the question of what are we asking? Some on the panel have pushed back on the focus on pre-election polls. Without these and elections to compare them to, how do we benchmark the accuracy of polls using other questions? So if there should be a little less focus on the election polls, how do we know we're getting the right information? Anybody want to touch on that?
I would say what we shouldn't do is, if we are weighting on the basis of age and region and race, then you can't just compare your sample on age and region and race and say that you've done a good job. So, unfortunately, I see that way too often where there have been either, some type of quota sampling or application of demographic weights, people then patting themselves on the back because, they have a distribution that matches those demographics, but that is by design. And so I think one of the things that again is an area for innovation is to think about what are some appropriate benchmarks and how we can get those and make that of use to the industry so that we can look beyond kind of the demographics that we tend to rely on right now.
That's great. The time is flying by. We've got about 5 minutes left. And so I would love to ask the panelists to do the impossible and each take about a minute and tell us what the future of polling is. And so we'll go through, I guess, let's go in the order I introduced our panelists. And so each of you will take a minute, tell us what's going to be the future or what you're and if you want to go into what you're looking toward, what you're most excited about, kind of anything in that realm. So Jen, why don't you kick it off here?
Sure. I think that the future of polling that I see going forward is one that embraces and uses the best benefits of the methodological diversity that I was talking about earlier, I think that we cannot be dependent on any one single methodology to tell us what the public thinks right now. And I do think that that extends beyond quantitative research to qualitative research. And I think that we need to really think holistically about how we are finding out what it is that people are living and experiencing and feeling in this world. I mean, I said I'm not really ready to walk away from RDD. That doesn't mean I am committed to exclusively conducting phone polls going forward. I think that there's going to be a lot more mixed mode. I think that there are going to be a lot more other data sources brought into things. And I do think the way that we benchmark and weight our polls, as Sunshine was talking about, is something that we're all going to be rethinking as we move forward. And as we realize that, age-based sex education just isn't going to get us there.
Excellent. Thank you. Scott, what's our future?
Yeah, I would endorse what Jen said. I think that that methodological diversity is absolutely critical for us to be able to navigate this period where cooperation is going down, distrust of institutions is going up. We need to figure out lots of ways to get it at our subjects and to gather information from them. And I think her point about qualitative research is well taken as well. But ultimately, as I said in my opening remarks, I'm optimistic that we have the talent in the field right now to be able to accomplish that. We are challenged in terms of resources, but we're not without resources. And I think that the world of mail surveys is still healthy. I think phone surveys can serve a function, and that panels probably are at the core of our future, but I wouldn't put all my money on them right now.
Excellent. And I'm thrilled that you maintained your optimism throughout the conversation, Scott. Sunshine, what do you predict for us?
So I guess maybe this is a little bit of wishful thinking, but I guess the thing that I look around and I see where we are in terms of the information environment, constraint on resources, and I think that we have to recognize as a society that information is the cornerstone of our democracy, whether that is the decennial census or it's the American Community Survey, or it is information about what the public thinks in between election cycles. And I think it's important that we invest in the infrastructure that allows us to be able to make sense of what the public wants. And I think it's going to take investment, not just from, individual pollsters or individual media organizations who have their own set of incentives that they're trying to work around, but it's going to take a concerted effort. And I think that institutions like the Roper Center are part of that. And I think that it is a kind of a charge that we as academics need to also take on, to take some leadership in figuring out the way forward for polling.
Thank you. David, what do you have for us?
Yeah, I'm trying to put my dean's hat on now. I think the future will depend heavily on how we utilize our public and private institutions to actually train people in democracy and understanding a civic world where we should understand what's happening, understand those voices that are not a part of leadership. And until we do that, we're in big trouble. But I think the future is bright. We have to not think about polls in terms of corporatization and just media, but in terms of good data that's not going anywhere that we can use to make good inferences about how society's working.
Terrific. Doug, you're up.
Yes, I think the last 20 years have been amazingly good years for survey research. We've had the democratization with things like tests and CCES that allow all sorts of people to conduct surveys who, when I was at my stage in my career, never would have had a chance of conducting a large-scale national survey. Surveys are still the best ways of getting at what people think and measuring behaviors that can't be measured other ways. think the future of the field lies in connecting data from different sources, whether it's things like voter lists or social media activity. But the survey is still going to play an essential role in measuring what's actually inside people's heads.
Wow. My quick survey of that, 5 for 5, I think, on the optimism side of the scale. So this is exciting. Tons of information here. I want to thank everybody in the audience for the questions and for tuning in. This was terrific. Of course, I want to thank our panelists for sharing their time with us and their thoughts and their insights. I'll encourage everybody to check out the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research. And thanks to everybody. I had a blast. This was terrific. I learned so much and so appreciative. So thank you, everybody.